Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
That's
So, hello
good.
and thank you for being here. How are you?
Yep. I'm very well. How are you? How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Thank you, very
That's
good. So,
that's good.
maybe a few words before we start for the people who will be watching this. So, my name is Mariana, and I'm a co-founder of Saga Books publishing house from Serbia. And
Yeah.
our very first book was Crossings by Alex Landragin. So this is the Serbian
Hmm.
version. And we have an honor today to have the author joining us for a coffee and an interview. So welcome. And thank you for being here all the way from Australia, in spite of the big time difference.
My
So,
pleasure.
yeah, so 9 a.m. here in Belgrade. What's the time in Australia now?
It's 5 o'clock, and it's a
Okay.
very wintry day today. The wind is blowing, the rain is falling. It's quite nice. It changes because our summers are long and hot.
Well, as a summer lover, I'm kind of jealous of long summers, but okay. People
Hmm.
love rain where the summer is too long. Okay, great. So maybe to start like with the whole crossing story and the story behind crossings, maybe we would like to ask you first, how did it all start? Where does your love for literature come from,
Oh,
actually?
okay. Well, my mother, who has an Armenian background, was a
Mm-hmm.
great storyteller. And she also was someone who would she never finished high school, but she loved to read and she always picked up books. So there were always lots of books in my childhood. And growing up, I had lots of different things in mind to do, but when I was about 16, I guess it really kind of became clear to me that there was no better thing to do with my life than to write fiction. And um, that was a process, but there were a few books that were a key to that. But one of them is Milan Kundera, the Czech writer, was a key writer for me when I was a teenager. So, and reading, I really became quite obsessed with him. So, as a result, he kind of set me on that path.
Mm-hmm. Well, beautiful. I mean, Kundera is one of my favorites too, so I completely understand now where the inspiration is coming from. So,
Hmm.
actually, that attaches to my next question, which was which books have shaped your reading taste? So you mentioned Kundera. So
Yeah.
maybe what's your favorite book of his, and also what were other influences on your reading and writing taste?
Well, Kundera was obviously formative when I was a teenager, but I must say that my favorite writer of all since then is Roberto Bolaño. He's a Chilean Mexican writer,
Hmm.
and his two great books are The Savage Detectives and 2666. And to me, he is like I describe him as my master in a sense. If I was a ninja warrior, he'd be my master. If I was a yoga practitioner, he'd be my guru. That kind of thing. Um, but I also there's a in relation to crossings. There's a few other kind of writers and books that have kind of helped inspire me. One of them is actually a Serbian, I believe is Serbian. That's Milorad Pavic, the Dictionary of the Khazars.
Yes, yes.
And that's a book I admire very much. I also, I love Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller. And I really love another key writer for me is George Perec and his book Life a User's Manual.
Hmm. Well, that's amazing, especially because we actually also were reminded of Milorad Pavic while reading
Uh-huh.
Crossing.
Yeah.
So now it kind of makes sense too. And actually, we are really glad that you also have a inspiration coming from our country too.
Hmm.
That's great. So,
The
um,
interesting thing about crossings is how popular it's been in southern and eastern Europe. And I know with like for example, the only country where it was a real bestseller was in Italy, and to me that was a great honor because I love Italian literature and I love Italo Calvino, as I just mentioned, and Umberto Eco and lots of others. So I think that in Southern and Eastern Europe that you have a little bit of a tradition that allows you to really connect with crossings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be true too, exactly. Because we have that kind of similar mentality in Southern
Yeah.
and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty great. So what is your view on contemporary world literature in general? So are there any authors or books you would highlight, maybe, speaking of contemporary ones?
Okay. Necessarily, I think I don't read a lot of, I don't try to keep up with contemporary literature.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the author, the contemporary author that has hit me the hardest in recent years is an Italian writer called Elena Ferrante. To
Mm-hmm.
me, I really enjoyed the Naples series, the quadrilogy, I think it's called,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't perfect, but I loved it, and it certainly kind of helped influence my own writing. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
one I would point to. I am also an admirer in American literature. I'm an admirer of Jonathan Franzen, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. So I'll just leave it
Mm-hmm.
at those two.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yes, for me, Elena Ferrante was also interesting. Though, as you said, maybe not perfect, but still, it kind of reminded me of those classics I used to love to read when I was younger. So yes, definitely, I also loved her. All
She's
four
one of
books.
those. She's one of those writers who is so good at what she's good at that you are willing to forgive what she's not good at.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
Mm.
So, speaking of crossings, when and how did you decide to write your first book? So, did you think in the beginning it would be a novel or a series of short stories? So, how did it all start?
It's a long story, and so I've always wanted to be a writer, but I'm a very slow writer. I'm very hesitant, and I'm not a natural writer, and I would even say I'm not the most gifted writer, certainly compared to those other writers that we've been talking about. So I was nearing my 40th birthday. I'm now in my early 50s, and about 12 or 13 years ago, I was approaching my 40th birthday, and I had been a writer my whole career for money. I was for a long time. I worked in travel publishing. I used to write travel guides, but I had never really kind of broken through as a fiction writer. And because my background is French and Armenian, and I was born in France and migrated to Australia as a child. I think part of the problem for me has always been that I never really kind of considered myself an Australian writer, but nor was I a French writer or an Armenian writer. I was just kind of a writer with no particular identity. So
Mhm.
I decided to try to break through all those obstacles by starting a blog where the idea was I would write a story every day and I would publish it every day. And I wanted to do that for a whole year. I really liked what the kind of automatic writing kind of potential that an idea like that kind of has. But I was at the time, so I started that and it started off very well and I enjoyed it a lot. I found it very rewarding and I thought maybe something will come of this. But in the midst of all that, in my private life, in my personal life, I went through a series of really quite tragic events
Mhm.
that really kind of were like an explosion in my life. But unfortunately, because they involve suicide and my ex-partner's family, I can't really, I'm not comfortable talking about that in public.
Of course.
But what I decided to do is continue to write this blog. And in the 7th month of this, I was getting so desperate for ideas that I went back to an event that took place when I was 18. When I was 18 at university, in first year university, I took a class in creative writing. And I remember it was like, it's a very strong memory for me. my instructor, my teacher came into class one day and he said, I just read the most marvelous story about a ship that discovers an island. And on this island, everyone knows how to cross from one body to another. And by the end of the story, you don't know who's gone and who stayed behind. And that's all, just about almost word for word. That's all he said. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, I wish I'd had that idea. So fast forward 20 years later, and I'm kind of looking for ideas, and I think to myself, well, because in the meantime, I had contacted my teacher and I said, can you tell me more about this story? Who wrote it? Where did you read it? And he said he'd completely forgotten about it. So it's lost. The origins of that story are lost. But I thought to myself, well, I'll write my own version of that story for this project, for this blog. And maybe at the bottom, I'll credit my creative writing teacher, which I did. But the next day I thought to myself, I was thinking about it and I was thinking, well, when the ship sails away, really, that's the beginning of another story, of another much bigger story, another much kind of more exciting, possibly, story. And that could be my story. Maybe even though I didn't have the original idea, maybe I can take that idea to the next level. And as part of this blog, I was also writing a series of stories about Walter Benjamin's final days. And so I thought, well, maybe I could connect it, like that ship story and the Walter Benjamin story. Maybe somehow I just intuitively thought I could connect them. And then I thought to myself, well, how would I connect them? And I remembered there was a story by, I think it's A.S. Byatt, an English woman, about Charles Baudelaire's muse and partner of 20 years, Jeanne Duval. And I knew that Walter Benjamin was obsessed with Baudelaire, and Jeanne Duval suddenly kind of emerged to me as the kind of character that would be ideal because she was such a hybrid character. So to cut a long story short, the more I looked into it, the more it made sense. And that was my experience all the way through. Look, it took about 7 years to write this book, and I often had the feeling that the book was using me to write itself. It sounds ridiculous, and I'm sure it's just projection, but that was how it felt.
A sort of channeling of the whole behind
Very
story.
much.
Well, that's
Yeah.
amazing. So it definitely, well, the story is amazingly crafted, I have to say, because there were so many details that you had probably to pay attention to. So no wonder it took 7 years. I mean, I could imagine it even took longer. So did you actually, because there are obviously two ways of reading the book. So did you write it linearly, or did you write it also the way the Baroness is suggesting?
So originally I wrote it with only one reading order in mind, and that was what is now the Baroness sequence. So originally it was a little bit like the Cloud Atlas. I should say that David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas was a bit of an inspiration for this as well. And originally it was going to be like that, where it was stories within stories. And then what happened was I wrote a full draft and I pitched it to various publishers here in Australia, and everyone said no. So I went back and decided to rewrite it. And while I was rewriting it, it just occurred to me, so this is quite late. Like, this is when I'm writing the second draft, the second full draft. I realized, I can do this. Wouldn't this be interesting? And of course, this brings up other books like Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, Julio Cortázar's Hopscotch, which were books that I knew and loved and was familiar with. And I thought, well, you know what? There are a bunch of books that have tried this, but as far as I know, there's no novel that gives you a choice of reading in two different sequences in that particular style. So it's not that Crossings has never been done before, but that particular kind of mechanism has never been done before, as far as I know. So I thought, well, that would be interesting to do. And secondly, I thought it also thematically, it worked really well with the themes of the novel. Like these two people who are who are separated, and they try to reconnect, and they do reconnect a few times, but they never really manage to quite come together again. I think the way that the novel is structured kind of gives the reader that kind of experience as well, because the reader is forever disconnected from the other possible reading experience, and will never have that other reading experience, but they know that the other reading experience is there, and if they had chosen if they made another choice, they would have gone in that direction. So it really kind of made sense to me to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, that was one of the most amazing things, because I'm really a book lover and I have read a lot of books, but I have never actually seen such a story where you have 3 separate manuscripts, but actually they can make also one single book. So it's really amazing. So I knew I had to do the translation in Serbian, and I'm especially honored because I also got to be the publisher of it. So thank you for trusting us. So yeah, well, my next question was actually how did because I know you're also a travel lover, and you said you also were writing a travel blog. So how did actually the travels shape your writing style? So are there any events or influences you kind of had while traveling, or how did actually traveling influence?
Travel and displacement are like the foundation of this novel. As I mentioned earlier, firstly, my mother, with being Armenian, in her background, there is just like endless migration.
Mm-hmm.
And then I migrated to Australia when I was 5. And then when I was 18, my family migrated to the US. And then I was a travel writer. And then when I got the idea for Crossings, I was living in Australia at that time, had just gone through that series of events that I alluded to earlier. But I knew straight away that I was going to have to move back to France and live in Paris just to be able to pull it off, because I knew that there was. I'm not a Parisian. Like I didn't know Paris well enough to be able to just write this. With the knowledge that I had. So I moved back to Paris, and I was living in Airbnbs, and I didn't have any friends, and I was really kind of living the life of a displaced person while I was writing this. And, my French was my original language, but in the course of my childhood, I kind of forgot how to speak French, and I later had to relearn it. So even the experience of speaking French and reading French was a displaced person's experience. So that really fitted in very well with the themes of the novel, which are all about displacement and the kind of longing for unity that never really happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely. So basically, you lived in Paris while writing about events from Paris, right?
Yeah, but it gets even more interesting than that, because 7 years before I wrote Crossings, because my parents lived in the US, it was always, and I ended up staying in Australia, but it was always a really big deal for me. Like, I always thought, oh, I shouldn't be living here. I should be living in the US, or I should be living in France. So I had I had a real neurosis around displacement for a lot of my life. And so 7 years before I had the idea for the novel, I had applied for a green card through my parents. And then I'd forgotten all about it. I'd gotten into a relationship and all that. But then around the time that I had the idea for Crossings, and my relationship broke up because of those events, weirdly, 7 years down the track, I got an email saying, "Oh, your green card has been approved." So I moved to France first, and I lived in Paris for about 8 months researching the novel, and then I moved to the US, and I was in the US for about 4 years, and I lived in Washington, or near Washington D.C., where my parents are, for a little while. I lived in New Orleans for a little while, and that's where the New Orleans sections of the novel come from.
Mm-hmm.
And then I lived in LA for a couple of years while I was rewriting the novel. And then eventually, around the time when the novel was picked up by the Australian publisher, Trump was elected. And at that point, I decided to come back to Australia, and I'm very happy here now.
Okay, so definitely, as someone who spent some shorter time in Paris, I really had a feeling that, and then it shows now that you say it, that actually, like I'm in Paris and walking all those streets and can actually see all the images. So it's very, very vividly shown. So that
I'm so glad to hear
goes.
you say that. I was so sensitive about that. Like I was very worried. There were a number of things about the novel that I was worried about, and that was definitely one of them. But the book has just been published in France, and my French publisher was very complimentary. So it looks like I pulled it off.
Definitely does. I mean, as someone who actually studied French literature and spent some time in France, I really felt like, I mean, I thought maybe because you are from France initially, that's because you managed to show it so well, but actually also lived there for a while writing the novel, so
Yeah.
it really shows. So you mentioned you were worried about different things. So can you discover maybe one other than Parisian story?
Yeah, for sure. Like I've always been worried about the possibility that I would be accused of cultural appropriation by people, for example, from the Pacific. Even though the island itself is an invented island, I tried to make it a realistic invented island, and I kind of borrowed in a uninformed way from Polynesian culture and Polynesian language. And so I've always been kind of worried about whether what I did was ethical. But then I think to myself, well, this is a book about colonialism about, in many ways. And that chapter where one of the characters returns to the island, I wanted to make that chapter a kind of critique of French colonialism in the Pacific, to show that actually that if I am guilty of cultural appropriation, then it's because my heart is in the right place, because I'm a critic of cultural appropriation. But I also kind of wanted to put appropriation and theft at the heart of the novel as a theme, which is why the first sentence in the novel is, I didn't write this book, I stole it. And as I've explained to you, that's true in at least two ways.
Yes, yes. Now it makes even more sense. But yes,
Mhm.
definitely you used it for good cause, actually, to show how one whole culture can be can disappear for colonialism. So yes, definitely. I also actually had an impression while reading all island story parts that you maybe might have heard some true story about some tribes who did crossings. I mean, true story, you know what I actually mean, but there are different tribes with different different customs and different way of doing their magic. So I just thought maybe
Absolutely.
you also actually had some heard some story about that. So that's actually you inspire yourself about the island part from stories, from fiction, and how did that island part? How come it sounds so realistic too? I mean, I have never been to islands, but it does sound like you lived there for a while too.
Well, Polynesian culture is fascinating, but as far as I know, there's no relation between real Polynesian culture and what I talk about in the book. You know, that's
Hmm.
it's purely fictional.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, who knows? Given that you channeled the book, who knows what's actually true and what was actually true? We'll never know. Especially because your teacher doesn't remember anymore where he read the story. So that's even
Exactly.
more fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would not be surprised if that original story did have some kind of Pacific element, because it was in Australia, it was in Melbourne, and we're very close to
Hmm.
that kind of part of the world.
Hmm. Yeah. So definitely that could be one of the influences that could help you write it this way.
Yep.
Speaking of that, what is your relationship with fantasy? So it's clearly present in the book. So do you enjoy reading books with such elements, or did the team naturally call for them, actually, in this case?
Yeah, it was my relationship with genre is I'm ashamed to say a snobbish one. I like literature, and my relationship with genre only goes so far as I'm only interested in genre when it's at the literary end of genre. So I'm not into detective novels, but I love Paul Auster's New York trilogy, that kind of thing. I love David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, but I've never read Lord of the Rings. I've never read Harry Potter. And I actually actively avoid reading genre. I don't know why. It seems like I love literature, and it just seems to me there's already so much great literature out there. Why would you? Personally, I'll make the choice of not going to genres. So, yeah, I'm not proud of that though, because I recognise that genre is wonderful in its own way, and so I'm not passing judgment on anyone other than myself.
No, I mean, I completely understand, because there is clearly a difference. I mean, I do love fantasy, but I think this is different. This reminded me more of Marquez, for example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this kind of magical realism rather than really fantasy. So there are some elements, but that's not the point of the book, as in Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. So there is a clear difference. Yes, so I absolutely understand. Yeah, so definitely speaking of different literature genres, so what is your favorite one? So you mentioned Kundera, you mentioned different authors, but if we have to pull one genre, what literature style, what could it be?
If I had to, if I had to pick a genre, I love detective fiction, the limited amount that I've read. And I also love I love not all, but some folk tales. I was just thinking, another writer that I love is a Russian writer called Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, I think she's called, and she writes these great folk tales, the contemporary folk tales that kind of have a bit of a magic element, but the magic is really creepy and like almost existential. Like it really has an emotional impact. So I guess they're the genres that I would love the most, and I'm always trying to achieve that effect that Lyudmila Petrushevskaya does very well myself, of that effect of just kind of trying to hit people with a sense of dread.
Yes, okay. So now I'm speaking about the title of the novel. So obviously Crossings is such a powerful name because it can be ambiguous and even has a lot of different meanings. But then again, it wasn't translated that way in title across all languages. So for example, we also did it differently because in Serbian, it wouldn't have that ambiguous meaning because we have different words for those meanings. So we couldn't kind of choose just one word. So that's why we translated it, look me in the eyes, to kind of transfer that message. So I don't know if you, because I also saw that there are a lot of different versions of your books. So do you have a favorite one in terms of title? Because it wasn't translated as Crossings everywhere.
That's right. So I initially I didn't like the Italian one, Storia di due anime, but it's done very well in Italy. So that must have resonated with readers very well. But I really like the French Le Livre des Passages because Walter Benjamin's. So in Crossings, I tell the story of the death of Walter Benjamin, and the key to it is a manuscript that he had when he died that went missing, and that's a lot of that section is actually based on real life. But in real life, people assume that missing manuscript was a draft of his great book, which is called in English, the Arcades Project, but in French I think it's just called Passage. So, and I think it's a very kind of strange and wonderful labyrinthine study of the shopping arcades in Paris that emerged in the 19th century. And there's a section in Crossings where he's trying to escape someone and he's going through all these arcades. And that was my way of kind of paying homage to Walter Benjamin. But so in French, it was called Le Livre des Passages, and I really like that because it does kind of echo the Walter Benjamin fascination with the arcades.
Okay, so he was the starting point for the title, but you also mentioned one of the central figures is actually Charles Baudelaire. So how did you prepare to write about him? So because he's clearly, I don't want to spoil for those who didn't read the novel, but he's clearly one of the most important characters in the book, and also one of my favorite poets, which is why I also love the book even more. So how did you prepare to write about him? So did you initially want to include him or only Benjamin? On how did that actually happen?
So it became clear early on that the book that to connect the ship leaving the island and Walter Benjamin, I had to have as the central part of the story of Charles Baudelaire and Jeanne Duval. And Jeanne Duval is a fascinating figure because she was a Haitian woman. She was a migrant to France from Haiti, and she was a very beautiful woman. She was a courtesan, and she was Charles Baudelaire's partner in a very kind of violent coming and going kind of way for 20 years. And then not much is known about her origins, and even less is known about her final days. Like she was a muse, not just for Charles Baudelaire, but for the whole Paris scene of that time for, at least a generation. And then she just disappears from history, and we don't really know what happened to her. And of course, this is something that is entirely to be expected, unfortunately, because she was a woman and she was a woman of color. But I thought to myself, well, what that meant was that it afforded me the luxury of inventing that final stage of her life where she was kind of, I think like Baudelaire, she had syphilis herself, and she was kind of very much kind of falling apart. But I tried to give her a kind of beautiful end of life using the poetic license that, is available to a novelist. Because to me, she deserves to be better known. As for Charles Baudelaire, I wanted to write about him, and so I read a biography of him. And the more I read of, I forget the biographer. She's an English woman, but it was a marvelous biography. And the more I read of it, the more I thought, this is all as if, I just thought that I can use so much of this. So there's a huge amount of the Charles Baudelaire section that is actually based on real events. For example, he did live in Brussels at the end of his life, and he lived in a hotel called Le Grand Miroir, the Big Mirror. And so all of that is true. And then he did go back to Paris, and he did, in his final days, lapse into a kind of insanity where the only words he could say the only word he could say was crénom, which is a kind of shortening of sacré nom, which means holy word, which is kind of so poetic in its own way, because like, what does a poet, central to the poet's existence is the idea of the holy word. So the Charles Baudelaire section was, in a sense, the most exciting to write because there was so much there that already kind of fitted so neatly into what I wanted to do.
So that's definitely, that is why it sounds so true that I actually wanted to dig deeper myself to compare, because it looks so real. And speaking of that lost manuscript, so did you also find in that biography you read that there was a mention of his lost manuscript somewhere, or
that's Walter Benjamin's lost manuscript? And yes, that lost manuscript is very famous, among those people who love Walter Benjamin, and there are many of them. you know, there is a lot of conjecture about that manuscript. Now, if you go to, so the very like Walter Benjamin died in real life and in the book in a little Spanish port called Portbou, which is about half a kilometre away from the French border. And if you go to Portbou now, there's a huge and very beautiful monument honouring the event of the death of Walter Benjamin. But there have been attempts to find that manuscript. And in fact, one person, I can't remember who it is, but there is one person who claims that they found that manuscript in the 1970s in some archive somewhere, but it was it had been damaged by water. It was basically it was decaying. Basically, it was as a result of water damage. So I think that manuscript, as famous as it is irrecoverable.
Yeah, so maybe you kind of recovered it.
I hope so.
In your book.
You know, like I often think to myself, what would Walter Benjamin have made of this kind of novel? And of course, there's a chance he wouldn't have liked it. But at the same time, what I thought was interesting about this novel, one of the interesting things about it was that, like I've read, I'm not a Walter Benjamin scholar at all. I'm not an expert, but I've read quite a bit of his work. And to me, if there is anything missing in the Walter Benjamin corpus, it's colonialism and the way the colonialism related to the center of the empire, which for him was Paris. And so I thought that I might flatter myself by writing a book that would in some way explore the link between some of Benjamin's ideas and preoccupations and colonialism.
Okay, so speaking of that, do you remember maybe what was the very first chapter or story you wrote? Was it about Alula? Was it about Walter Benjamin? So do you maybe remember what was the first subject you worked on?
I think I do, and I think it was a section that never made it into the book. It was a fourth section, and it was the logbook of Captain Etienne Marchand, the captain of the ship, where he talks about discovering the island and what happens on the island. And I remember I wrote this early on, and I even kind of put it up on Facebook. I was so proud of it. But then later on, it seemed to me unnecessary, so it fell out, and never made it into the book.
Well, that's so interesting. And so do you maybe did you ever at some point think that you might publish it as a separate thing, or that you could
no, I've always seen Crossings as a trilogy. So I don't know. Like I'm now writing another novel for my US publisher, which has nothing to do with Crossings. Although I think there might be some world. It might be in the same world. I'm not sure about that, but I would like to write the two following installments if I possibly can later on. But in order for that to happen, I think, you see, I wrote Crossings, in English we say on spec, which means you write it for nothing, hoping that someone will publish it later. And now that I'm in the system, for this second novel, I was given an advance, and it feels like much more civilized to be paid in advance to write. So maybe I've become spoilt, but I don't really feel like writing the two sequels on spec. I'm hoping someone will pay me to do it. But we'll see. Who knows what the future holds?
Yeah. Well, who knows? But definitely, we would always be interested in reading other book, be it related to Crossings or not really. So you mentioned you're writing. Yeah.
I'll just add one thing. Writing Crossings almost made me mad. Like I almost lost my sanity writing this book. That's why I'm a little bit reluctant to do that again for nothing. You know, like if you're going to push me to the edge, I'd like to be paid.
Yeah, so that had to be a big passion for literature and for this story, because I can only imagine how hard it can be to actually. So you probably had to change some details. So how did you actually connect so well, or all the details? Because it had to
Well,
be really difficult.
weirdly, I didn't have to change much, because it kind of was already there. It already kind of made sense, and so as I remember the day that I had the idea to do it, and as I say, it was quite late in the process, and I thought, actually, it's not too much. It's not too bad. I can do this, So, yeah, I probably had to do a little bit of rewriting, but there was so much rewriting all along the way, even after it was published. Like the Australian edition was published, and then I reread it, and I found about 50 or 100 things, little things that I wanted to change. So for the US edition, there's a whole heap of little changes. So yeah, the two editions in English are different, and you probably translated it from the Australian edition, I guess. Is that right?
Yes, yes, because that
Yeah.
was the one that they sent me.
I should make it clear to my agent that any translations from now on should be from the US edition. It's just slightly better in lots of little ways.
Okay, so now we are interested to know in which way. So were those only language changes or also event changes? So in what way was
No
it?
events, just little things, just tiny little things, little details. It's a real details kind of novel. It's quite an intricate mechanism. I often use the word mechanism in relation to this novel because it's like it's a it's a 3D puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of I and in ordinarily I'm not a details guy, but in order to pull this off, I really had to become a bit obsessed with the details.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would never say you are not a details guy, because it's definitely I think I never could have craft so many details at the same time, being not being a detailed person in
Mhm.
general. I mean, I have to really pay attention to details in order to see them. So this is really even
Well, I
more
think
amazing than.
anyone who translates is a details person, surely.
Well, that's true. I mean, I am a translator myself, but in general, I meant from the point of view of a writer. It's different when you
Mhm.
translate.
Of
That I'm
course.
used to watch, all the language, tiny differences. But speaking of writing a story, I think that's a whole different.
Yes.
Uh,
But I'm
uh,
fascinated by translation. I would love to be a translator myself. And in fact, this next novel that I'm writing, translators are a big part of it.
mhm. Okay, so before we start about the next novel, I also wanted to ask you, because you are also obviously French speaker. Did you ever
Mhm.
like read your book in French, or maybe also try to translate parts into French?
Mm. So, um, when before when I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, I can't wait for this to be published in French, because then I'm going to read it. I'm going to read my own book in French, and obviously, being of a French background, I thought that would be a big thrill. But a couple of months ago, my French publisher sent me a few copies of the French translation, and I'm afraid to open it. Like it's like there's some kind of neurotic blockage there. I haven't opened it, but I'm looking forward to it. But the moment hasn't felt right, because now that I'm writing the new novel in a certain way, I have to try to push Crossings away as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
because Crossings was such a monster to write. It really took me over. As I said before, it almost kind of sent me mad. That and afterwards, I was so proud of it. I really have to put that all really in in the cupboard, so that I can really focus on this new project.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't read it in French. And the other thing was, it was published in Spanish last year, and I thought, oh, maybe I could teach myself to speak Spanish by reading my own novel. That was going to be my big project for 2025. But again, I haven't done that. And again, for the same reason, is like I really need to move on from crossings if I'm ever going to write another good book in my life.
Yeah, so I can understand that too, because you're afraid that you'll unconsciously take influences again into the new novel
Yeah, but
which you.
also because so Crossings was moderately successful, but even that small amount of success went to my head, and that's not good for me as a creative person. Like I think I work best when I am coming from a position of some humility and challenge. And so initially, in the little period after Crossings was first published, and it had with the little success that it had, suddenly I thought I could do anything. And since then, I realized that actually, no, writing is still just as hard as it's always been. And those central kind of points of those obstacles that were always there, like for me in particular, where to set my stories. The thing about Crossings is it allowed me to kind of reach around all those problems around location and geography, which are real problems for me as a writer. But now that I'm trying to write another novel, I have the same problems all over again. So what I need to do is really kind of be humble and be try to be as focused as possible. But one of the big differences between now and when I first started writing Crossings was I first started writing Crossings 12 years ago. 12 years ago, we were only just starting to be colonized by phones. And since then, in the 12 years since then, I feel like my mind and many people's minds have been thoroughly colonized by this new technology. And so I feel like my own ability to focus on my writing has changed. And I really need to I would need to work hard on that kind of long, deep focus that you need in order to write a novel.
Well, that is definitely true, because I feel like all this technology took our attentions to so low level that sometimes when I want to be focused, I just lock my phone in another room. I don't want
So
to
do I.
have
So
it
do I. In fact,
near.
often I'll go to the library and leave my phone at home just so I can have 2 or 3 hours of uninterrupted concentration,
Hmm.
which used to just, we used to have an endless supply of that. But now we always have this thing. Even now, as I talk to you, my phone is just next to me, monitoring me, keeping a watch over me. So it's I feel like we're in a different world now.
Hmm. So speaking of that, and of your next novel, so can you maybe discover some details without spoiling? And also, so how does you mentioned that now technology is maybe affecting your attention, but still, how is it? In what way it is different to write now compared to Crossings, given that you're not writing about the same things now that you used to write before? So.
So yeah, I've had, you must have heard of difficult second novel syndrome. It's a famous thing that writers have, and I have it, and I think I have it just as bad as anyone else, maybe worse. So I had to kind of think about, well, what am I going to do? Like Crossings is like a magic trick that you can really only do once. So what am I going to do next? And I fished around for ideas. I looked for that moment of inspiration that I had with Crossings, which was kind of like a falling in love moment. But now it's like this is my second marriage, and I think after you've been married once, the second time is different. You can't expect to fall in love a second time the way that you fell in love the first time. So how to respond to that particular problem? My It's been a long journey, and I'm still in the very early stages of the next one. It's really just about a group of friends, and I'm setting it in Marseille, which is where my mother's family is based, and I've lived in Marseille a number of times. But it's really about a group of people who are from elsewhere who find themselves in Marseille, and it's a group of friends. they get into some trouble. And as a result of the trouble they get into, some of them are translators, but they're not just translators, but they're kind of all interested in language. And they get into some kind of trouble that I haven't quite figured out what the trouble is, but it's serious enough that at the end of it, when the trouble happens, they all disperse and they promise each other not to contact each other so that they don't get into trouble with one another. But the problem is that the trouble that they got into keeps searching for them, and not 10 or 20 years later, they have to kind of contact each other again to try and not get into more trouble. So I think that's about it. That's all I can say for now, and that's more than I've been able to say.
We're grateful for the details.
Yeah.
Thank you for discovering this. That's already interesting and enough to know for now. We are looking forward to reading it once it's done. And speaking of that, how does a writer really know when the book is finished? You know, how did you know for the first one now it's finished? You know, so
yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with how much money you have left, because like with crossings, you know, like the real deadline I had was how much money do I left in the bank? You know, how much time does that money buy me? You know, so now I have probably about enough money left to keep writing for another few months, and then so hopefully it'll be finished in a few months.
Yes, that
otherwise I'll be in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, that reminded me, I think, of Dostoevsky. He also was writing kind of, you know, based on the account. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like art is supposed to be a pure thing, and artists are not supposed to kind of worry about money too much. But in fact, you know, like when you're an artist, you're essentially a self-employed business person, and your business is yourself and your work. So you do have to, I find it a very, you know, like if I had to give advice to a young writer, I would say, you know, don't be obsessed with money, but be careful with money. It's important. It's important to be, you know, like you need time to write, and money buys you time, essentially. So it's a business, and you have to think of it in those terms, unfortunately.
Well, we are still in the real world, so that's definitely
exactly
true, and that it is what it is. Yeah, c'est la vie. What in French they would say. So yes, I also initially meant in sense of you mentioned for crossings that you did the second draft was kind of different than the first version you sent to the publisher. So in that sense, I meant what was the very last part you wrote? Maybe was it the part where
yeah. That's a good question. I think it might be the very last chapter of the Alula section, the section that's called Tales of the Albatross in English. Yeah, I have a hunch that that was the last one. Yeah.
And so speaking of the very first part, so where the bookbinder from Paris is speaking about the manuscript he found. So was it actually one of the last parts you wrote? Because I don't know if you initially meant that it would be like that. So
well, the last one, like I don't know if you translated it, but in English, the last part of the novel that I would have written would have been either the acknowledgements, which I don't know if you translated that, but the acknowledgements have been translated into some languages. And, you know, weirdly, in terms of my regrets with this novel, in some ways, I have more regrets about the acknowledgements than I do about any other section in the novel. You know, like I'm always thinking, oh, you know, I should have included that person and that person, you know. And also the biography of myself, which in the English edition, I wrote that I was a second-generation bookbinder who lives in Paris, because I wanted to extend the joke. Because in a sense, Crossings is a joke, you know, like it's
Mm-hmm.
it's supposed to be playful. It's a game. So I wanted to extend the game and to further collapse the boundary between the real world and the fictional world. So it might. I think those two things are the last things I wrote.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did translate acknowledgements, yeah, because they were in the Australian edition too, so
Mhm.
we did translate them. And also now that I opened the book, I also reminded myself of Attila Jožev poem. I mean the part of it which is if you are already born. I mean now I have a Serbian version, don't have the English one, but better be born 7 times. And then
Yeah.
I wanted to find the whole poem. I mean I read it in English because I don't speak Hungarian, but it is beautiful. So, how did you find out about that poet? And I mean, did you just come across him once you started writing, or was it already one of
No,
your?
no.
Yeah.
That poem is kind of you know one of my favorite and one that's probably one of the things that's most affected me of in any art form. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't read a lot of poetry, but I read that about 20 years ago for the first time, and it really kind of took hold of me, that poem. To me, it's like it's a moral compass. You know, you could live your life. That poem could be a religion in just in itself, you know, like to me it's a way of life, you know, and it's an ethos. It's just so beautiful. I can't speak highly enough of it. And so um, I should have mentioned that poem as part of the when I answered your earlier question about some of the influences that but that poem has done more than influence Crossings. It's influenced me because what that poem because I am essentially a hybrid person. You know, I am a multiple person. I don't have multiple personality disorder or anything like that, but I am essentially a dislocated person, a displaced person, and that displacement is multiple and it goes back generations and generations. So that poem gave me a way of bringing all of those separate things together and remembering also that amongst all the multiplicity of my life and of our lives, there is also always a need for some kind of authenticity at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that in Hungary, Attila Jožev is still a very well-known person. Whenever I meet a Hungarian person, I mention that poem, and they all know it. I think it must be taught
Mm-hmm.
in schools or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess every culture has a poet like that, but I think that poem should be universally famous, and because he was one of those proletarian poets that translate very well. I'm sure it's better in Magyar, but it's very powerful in English.
Definitely. I mean, it's sure that when translating poetry, the translated version is kind of always a whole new poem, but at the same time, the message is universal, and I find it beautiful too. So definitely,
Mm.
I'm so also grateful to because I discovered him from your book actually, and then that's how I started reading his poems, and I found it fascinating. We even translated part of the poems for our Instagram page to show the readers the beauty of this of his verse. So
I,
yeah,
I,
thank you for.
I'm glad you picked up on that because not many people have. But to me, that in English it's called an epigraph, I think, and
Hmm.
that epigraph is central to the novel. And I'm hoping that people who love the novel will hunt down that poem and read that poem because you know there are seven. In Tales of the Albatross, there are seven incarnations of
Hmm.
Alula, and each
Hmm.
one of them corresponds to one of the seven babies crying.
Yeah. Yes. So that's the start of the very start of the whole story, and has a hidden message and is very powerful. I definitely leave the link in English and Serbian to the poem under the video so that people who are interested can find it too, among other authors we mentioned here. So yes, that's definitely one of another big discovery I had while reading this wonderful book. So Maybe one of the other questions, because you love traveling and you traveled a lot. Did you ever go to Serbia? And if not, would you ever plan to visit it?
Well, believe it or not, in 2009, because my Armenian grandparents were from Istanbul. My mother grew up in the Soviet Union. That's a long story, but they were my beloved Armenian grandparents, who were wonderful and big influences on me, grew up in Istanbul, and they ended up moving via the Soviet Union to Marseille in France. So in 2009, I thought it would be neat to backpack from Istanbul to Marseille overland, and which is what I did. And I went through Serbia on my way, and I stopped in Belgrade and spent a couple of days in Belgrade, which I enjoyed. But it was only a couple of days, and I didn't know anyone locally, so it was a disconnected experience. But it was just a flavor, and sometimes when you travel, or especially when you travel alone, and I'm a bit shy as well. So, like, all you can get is a little flavor, but I think a little flavor is better than no flavor at all.
Sure.
So I went through Belgrade, and then I went through Bulgaria, and then I went through Serbia, and then I went through Bosnia, which was great. I ended up going to Albania, crossing into Italy, and I went to Naples, which was great because later when I read Elena Ferrante, I had a sense of the place. I went down to Palermo, which was important to me because there's a Sicilian novel called The Leopard by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, which is very important to me, one of my key novels. So I got to see Palermo, and then I took a ferry to Genoa. And, Genoa was the favorite city of Borges, the Argentinian writer, who was one of my favorite writers. So, and then I ended up and then from Genoa I went to Marseille. That was a wonderful trip, and I actually blogged that trip. So I have about 20,000 words that every now and then I think I should find that again and turn it into a novel if I can. But yeah, so the long answer to your question is yes, and I had a wonderful time.
We're glad to hear that, and we hope that someday you will also actually visit us, and then you will have a local guides there too. So during your travel through Europe, apparently, was there a particular place that maybe you loved better than the others? Because being from this area of Europe, I kind of know all the places, so I'm interested to know from your point of view, what was your favorite place?
Well, I really do love Istanbul. I've been there a number of times, and my love for it only grows more and more the more I find out about it. One of my favorite books is Orhan Pamuk's book about Istanbul, which is just called Istanbul, Memories of a City, and I love that book. I just recently found out last year that my grandfather, who was a shoemaker, had a workshop in his youth that was very close to the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. So that kind of makes me want to go back even more and once again. But other than that, I think the place that really impressed me most was Naples. I really love Naples, and in particular, the public library in Naples is one of the most. I love libraries. I have one of my little themes when I travel is visiting libraries, and the library in Naples is just amazing because it's an old palace, so it's incredibly an old Rococo palace. So like there's just painting everywhere you look. But it's also a little bit dilapidated and falling apart, just like Naples itself. So
yes, but that's the beauty.
Yeah. And I love Genoa as well. Genoa is another, a little bit like that too. It's just, there's palaces everywhere you look, but it's also a bit cramped and, a bit falling apart as well. So they would be my pick. But, I still have so much to see. I really want to go to Trieste. That's probably next on my list. And, so.
Yeah, so, I mean,
it never ends.
Yeah, with Italy especially, it's a never-ending story, you know. Like I think every time I am thinking of my next location, I somehow end up in Italy. So
I
yeah,
don't
that's
blame you.
definitely
Italy
definitely.
is my favorite country to travel in. I love it.
Hmm.
What I love about Italians is how easily they talk with one another in public. And in Australia, it's something that people don't really do very much. You know, people
Hmm.
always say Australians are friendly, but in fact, Australians are not very friendly at all. They're not aggressive, but they're very reserved. And the interesting thing when you travel from France into Italy, almost as soon as you get over the border, suddenly people are talking to one another on the train and all that. You know, in a way that in France they never do. It's a
Hmm.
beautiful.
Yeah, so that's definitely some kind of different mentality, which I also noticed being
Mm.
from, I mean, working with different languages and talking to different people. I definitely noticed that. But that in Serbia, I mean, in Serbia, we are more kind of like Italians, I have to say. Like we also are loud talking to each other. And I also
Mhm.
have an impression that in Spain, it's the case too. Whereas in
Mhm.
France and Germany, it's different. So
Very,
yeah, that
very
depends.
different.
So for Australia, I didn't know it, but yeah, so now you're also confirming that. So probably then your multi-origin background helps you kind of be open to other cultures, right? And to talk to people.
Well, it makes me curious, but I'm also actually, you know, like I'm a classic writer in the sense that I'm a neurotic. So I'm also shy, you know. So there's definitely when I travel, there's always that kind of push and pull of wanting to connect, but also preventing myself from connecting and never quite connecting enough, always wanting to connect even more, you know, which I don't think I'll ever get over, actually. I think that's just who I am.
Hmm. Well, that's probably also because as a writer, you're kind of a person who just watches the world carefully without trying
Yeah.
to interrupt
Yeah.
anything. So like kind of noting down your ideas mentally, I guess.
I often say that a writer is somebody who has such an urgent need to express themselves to the world that they lock themselves up in a tiny room and hide away from the world in order to do it. You know, like there's a fundamental contradiction there.
So like instead, yeah. Uh-huh.
Unlike a musician, for example, because I also play the piano. So I play jazz piano, and sometimes I do gigs. And with you know, when you're a musician, you get that instant connection. But when you're a writer, there's a delay. You know, that connection you never really get a strong, except for occasions like today. But most of the time, you don't get a sense of how it's resonating with people, especially because publishers and agents, they never tell you anything about how things are selling. So you don't know if it's selling well or selling badly. I never hear about reviews. I don't really even want to know, to be honest with you. But it's what I mean is it's a very disconnected kind of way of reaching out to people.
Hmm. So I have to say, I mean, in Serbia we are a new publisher. It's a very first book, but so far it's getting very good reviews. Like people who love literature are also in love with the book and fascinated by the style. So I'm sure
Okay.
that with time they will hear even more about it. So so
I hope
speaking
you're
of,
right.
mhm, yeah.
I really, what I hope with Crossings is that it's a book that has a long afterlife, and you know that people will be reading in 5 or 10 years, hopefully, or even longer, because I think that's the greatest compliment of all. You know, more than prizes. I mean, there are so many prize-winning books that just disappear, and then you
Exactly.
know, you think, oh, whatever happened to that person? You know, they were a big star for a moment. But to me, like the best literature endures over time, and I'm hoping that this will be the case with Crossings.
I'm sure exactly. Well, that's also the case for music and for books. So every music or book that passes the test of time is actually the evergreen
Yeah,
piece of art, definitely.
yeah.
So I'm sure it will happen for your book because it's definitely. I mean, as a book lover, I have always had this dream of starting a publishing house, but I never actually knew what the first book could be. And then when I read this one, I just knew that the first thing I Googled is if it's published in Serbian, and when not, then I had to find out if the rights are still available.
Are you what's next?
So the next thing, well, it's hard to choose after this. I think we are going to choose some classic I won't discover because I want to surprise the readers, but probably some classics. And we are also thinking about sort of realism, so maybe not magical realism, but something like that. I mean, definitely the few next books will be like world classics literature. And speaking classics of contemporary,
Serbian language classics, or
no Scandinavian, which will be translated into. I mean, it kind of already was translated before, but hasn't been published in Serbia for a long time. So yeah, those kind of projects for now. And we are also carefully looking for another contemporary author because it's hard to choose. I mean, we have to keep up with the high literature pace.
I can imagine. Yeah. I think it would be very hard to have a job that makes it necessary to read a lot. Like translators, yes, but also especially agents and publishers. I don't envy them at all. The amount they have to read, I think when you consume that much, it must warp your experience a little bit, and often would diminish from the pleasure.
Well, yes, and no, at the same time, I have to say, because that way you also kind of have a high criteria, because after having read so many manuscripts and books, I have to say that now, even when I start, I already have a feeling, if it will turn into something or not, because of so many books that I had to read. So yes, you're right in the sense that you maybe lose that reader's pleasure, but at the same time not, because when you recognize the quality, you always feel the same pleasure as a casual reader.
Do you know if Roberto Bolaño has been translated into Serbian?
Sorry, which one?
Roberto Bolaño.
Not sure. I would have to note it down and investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, investigate, because if he has not been translated into Serbian, then I would recommend you you look into it, because he, as I mentioned him before, he's my favorite writer, and yeah, that might be an avenue for you.
Thank you for recommendations. So we'll definitely have to check the Serbian catalog of published literature, to make sure that if it's available. So thank you for that too. And I will also try to make a list of all recommendations and writers you mentioned, so that for us and for people who are interested too in finding out more about it all.
Right.
So I'm really grateful for having you here today, for you that you shared all your experiences as a writer and as a traveler across the world. So thank you for being here. And
thank you for your enthusiasm, and thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. As I say, it's such a disconnected experience writing that these interactions mean a lot.
Thank you. I mean, it means a lot for us too that you first accepted to be the first book in our company, and also for having accepted to be here today with us. And we are always glad to have a real life experience with authors, and we are hoping to hear about your second book soon too, and read it.
Okay, great.
So thank you, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mariana. Likewise. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.